To another episode of the Startup Therapy Podcast. This is Ryan Rutan, joined as always by Wil Schroter, my friend, the founder and CEO of startups.com. Will, oftentimes early stages, we get super obsessed with building our product, right? We forget that the product isn't actually the business, that the revenue we generate from that product is actually the business. There's this other piece of narrative out there that says like, well, I need the funding so I can go build the product, so I can go make the money. And I think we want to break that down today and expose the level of bullshit that's involved in that particular line of logic, which, yeah, you might need money to go build the product, but you don't always have to get all the way to your dream product before you start to make revenue. So today, let's beat the hell out of that notion.
The money always comes first.
Yeah.
Like how you make it is the
Exactly.
broken assumption. So to build on what you said, obviously the assumption is going to be, I need investors to be able to build my product, go make money for my product.
Yep.
So I can't do anything until I get investors. That is a very broken assumption because it assumes that the only way to generate money is from that particular product at that particular stage.
Correct.
Which, if you talk to enough founders, ourselves included, and today we'll talk about a lot of other really famous, successful founders that thought otherwise. You'll start to realize that the early stages aren't really about just building the product and getting to market. It's about generating cash.
Yeah.
And having enough to stay alive.
To that product.
Exactly. And so whenever I walk through, with a founder who's going through this like crisis, this chicken and egg thing, I always walk them through a series of like tiers of how you can generate revenue now ahead of product and then eventually get to it. And it's progressive. It's like things that are very specific to what the product is to a little bit less specific to has nothing to do with it, but it still makes sense.
Yeah.
And so I thought it'd be cool to walk through those tiers and maybe like talk about some of the companies that have done this, at each of those tiers at some level of scale, ourselves included.
Yeah.
So
there's going to be some surprising examples in there, I would imagine, in terms of like, I think a lot of people think, oh yeah, if you're building something small, you can do that. You can build something really big starting exactly like this.
And that's the point, right? It's that, again, the broken assumption is that in order for us to build this business, it has to be exactly the product we're thinking about, and there's nowhere in between. And that's just a junior amateur assumption. Yep. Right. And I know some folks that are listening, like, screw you, I'm not an amateur. I know what I'm talking about. You're using the wrong framing. And it applies to nearly every business. I'm sure someone listening this won't apply to. I get it.
Sure.
Short of that, it applies to more people than you think. So let's open up with one of my favorite examples in what I call option one, which is basically just saying what's the smallest possible version that even could remotely look like this product that you could sell today. Yeah. Right. And so we call it the MVP and things like that. I'm saying in some cases, even before the MVP, right? Sure. The minimum viable product, the least minimum viable product, right? The ridiculously minimum viable product. And so tell you guys a story. I'm always fascinated about Zappos as a company. They're not really a big name anymore, but back in the day, they were it. Right, like Tony Hsieh was running around and rest in peace. And he was running around talking about this story of having grown this thing to $1 billion.
Right.
What a lot of people don't know is Tony Hsieh did not start this company.
That's right. There's some really interesting backstory here.
He Elon Musked it, right?
Yep.
He did a little revisionist history about how that thing actually got started. There's another guy that was the actual founder, Nick. I can never pronounce his name. It's like Swinmurn, I think. The fact that I don't know tells you everything you need to know.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Yeah.
And the fact that Tony Hsieh's last name, Hsieh, would be impossible to pronounce if you hadn't heard Tony Hsieh's name 10,000 times, right?
Yeah.
So here's what he does. Nick, in the early days, before Zappos is even like barely a concept, and this is like back in 99, a long time ago, Nick decides that he wants to sell shoes online. Why? I have no idea, right? But he decides like that's his thing. What he does is he goes to shoe stores and he takes like really good pictures of the shoes in the stores because back then you couldn't Google it. Google didn't exist yet. Also, you didn't have camera phones, by the way. Mobile phones wouldn't come out in a meaningful way for like 5-6 more years, right? So he's bringing like old school digital, camera, and he's shooting pictures. This is bananas to me. He's shooting pictures of shoes in stores that are not his, like his inventory, and then posting them online to sell them as his inventory, which is fine. I mean, so long as the shoe gets shipped to who it's supposed to go to, sort of who cares?
Who cares, man? We've all heard that phrase, assume the sale. In this case, he was not only assuming the sale, he was also assuming the inventory. I love it, man. It's as scrappy as it gets.
But I mean, if you think about it, like every drop shipper does that,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
It's exactly what a drop. Probably half the companies on Amazon do that,
Yeah,
right? They're listing a bunch of inventory that smartly they don't purchase
they
until
don't
they
buy
actually get the
until
sale.
they've got a
It's
customer.
drop ship.
Yep.
Yeah. What's interesting to me is he goes on to do this, and a couple things happen. One, he starts proving whether the demand is there. Remember, this
Yeah.
is like long, like e-commerce wasn't a thing.
No.
Nowhere near. It's like
Especially not for things like this, right? Not for things where size and fit were important and returns are complicated. Then nothing like this was going on.
Totally. And so, like, huge pioneer in that space, which is
Yep.
incidentally why Amazon bought them. But beyond that, the second thing that he did is that he took that activity
Yeah.
and he brought it to investors.
Yeah.
That's where Tony Hsieh came in.
He
Tony Hsieh and
validated the
Alfred.
value, right? They
Yeah,
validated
exactly.
would actually do, because you could go and just build the platform, build the website, try to run around it and raise money to build the product, only to find out that, yeah, people still aren't ready to buy shoes online, right? So he started by validating these really important assumptions before having to throw any real money at it.
My favorite thing to tell an investor when they pull their inevitable know-it-all moment in the pitch, when they're like, yeah, but people are never going to do that, is like, yeah, except they are.
Yeah, here's a list of 1,000 people that already did exactly that. So let's move on.
Yeah. And that shuts down the conversation very quickly, because it's easy to say no one will ever do that if it's never been done.
Yeah.
Really hard to back up. And by the way, you made that up.
Yep.
Like, you literally made that up, right? So yes, you're the investor and it's your choice to believe whether that's true, but you also don't know that it's true. You just made it up. So when I can politely but defiantly fire back, yeah, except that we've already done it, then all of a sudden conversation completely changes. And I think that move by Nick, the founder, is what would have drawn in a guy like Tony Hsieh and Alfred Lin, like, the early investors who put in 500K.
Somebody who's not only showing that level of hustle that we love to see, but somebody who also went out and validated a really important part of this, which is that people will buy the inventory if it exists. Returns and all of this other stuff that everybody was really worried about at that time aren't as much of a problem. Said differently, there's ways around it. We found ways to do this. And so he took a lot of risk off the table. I don't remember if it was you or Elliot who first broke this down for me this way, but we were talking about just like a general thesis of investing, and it going from like being pure demand to pure capacity. And that, investors love to invest on the capacity side. Capacity side. I guess where I put capacity is my left hand, rather than demand side. Because if you got to go prove demand, there's a lot of risk in that money. The minute you can say, no, we've already found that people want to do this. Now we just need a better system, our own inventory, all these other things that will come along with it. But you've eliminated some of those really early analytical barriers and emotional barriers for the investors and for yourself, right? At this point, you don't have to go, I wonder if they'll do it. Right? We know.
I'll give you an example. Years and years and years ago, this is this bizarre. I'm going back this far. I used to own a nightclub, right? Very long time.
Been to that nightclub.
Yeah, very long time ago. And what happened? The reason I opened a nightclub, easily one of the dumbest decisions I ever made, was because prior to that, I was hosting lots and lots of parties and events at my house. I'm in my 20s at the time, right? And eventually, these things got so big that like I just couldn't host them at my house anymore. And at one of these events, a guy who had a space downtown that actually used to be a nightclub approached me, and he said, "Will, there's a ton of liability here. This is actually like, not a great idea." Right. He was not wrong. He's like, here's another not great idea.
Yeah.
He's like, I've got a space where you can host this and do it there. So I did. But here's why I bring that up. I bring that up because I tested demand. I already had a list of 5,000 people, which back then, this is like in the 90s, like it was insane to have like a local list.
And when you say list, you mean it was actually probably written on paper.
Yeah, exactly. And like, this is long before social media, right? And so I had already proven demand. So when I went to go open up said nightclub, I just invited all the people that I had already been bringing, to my house. And so, side note, it was a terrible idea, but not because it didn't work.
It was a validated terrible idea.
It was validated. It was validated that I don't want to be in the nightclub business. Anyway, point is, when people talk about, I can't possibly move forward because I don't have the final product.
Yep.
Rewind that back. Let's assume, Ryan, you and I decided that we wanted to open up a nightclub, but we have to have investors in order to pay for the space and do the build out, et cetera. And that would be true. But what we're saying is, but that's not the first version of the product.
Right. First version of the product is a party or a cocktail or something, anything.
Exactly.
Getting together to do something. Yep.
Exactly. It's creating events. It's, again, if we were opening up like a bakery, something less douchey, if we were opening up a bakery And I was like, I can't, we need like $250,000 to open up this bakery. My first thing is, no, we need to do events where we're baking the product at our house. We're bringing to the events and we're getting customers. We're building social media around that. We're going to pop-ups, things like that. That's the early version of the product before it's the full product. In both cases, we're selling whatever we're baking.
Yeah.
But we're not waiting for the capital intensive part to begin.
Right. We don't need to build the Wonder Bread factory. We can just open it with an oven. Yeah. It's so rare. Will, I'd love to hear your take on this, but it's so rare that I run into somebody who's working on that MVP where I look at the MVP and I don't go, that's 3x what you actually need to build, right? It's almost always overwrought and overbuilt. And there's just such a simpler version that will actually, here's the other thing. When you build a really simple version of things, you get to test a lot faster, one, so you have some answers. But I've always found there's always more clarity in those experiments because you're not looking at as much stuff. You're like, if I bake and then go to sell, do people buy the stuff that I bake? That's what we have to answer first, because if that doesn't happen, then it's like, well, should we get a Blodgett oven or a Vulcan? I don't care. Doesn't matter. Nobody buys your stuff because you're a terrible baker. This is why I started jokingly saying, the VP, the MMMMVP, the much more minimum viable product.
Yeah.
Right? And it's so important to do this because it saves you so much time, so much heartache, and it gives you clarity. Again, like just because you simplify that experiment, it's easier to understand what's actually happening. But we talk to founders all day, every day, Will, and so I'm sure you're seeing the same thing I am. But at the getting customers level, there's so many folks where they're like, okay, and should be able to get customers the next 6 months when I do this. And I'm like, you realize if you just rethink what you're looking at right now, you could start getting customers next week. Really?
Right. And part of it, we see a lot of mobile apps and people are like, well, I have to have the mobile app in order for this to work. I'm like, are they buying the mobile app or what the mobile app does?
Yep.
They're like, well, it's a matchmaking app. You match a ton of people. You can match people on social media right now.
Yeah.
Right. You can call whatever service.
I can match people by walking them down the street if I need to. Right.
100%. Right. There's always a more manual way to create the product. And I've mentioned one other example in the past when we did unsubscribe.com.
Yeah. That's a great one.
It's like, when I explained it to my co-founders, I was like, hey, it's this idea for a tool to allow you to get off of any email. This is like back in the mid 2000s when that was actually really hard to do.
Yep. Canned spam hadn't been written yet. Yeah. Unsubscribe wasn't a policy. Yeah.
Yeah. And then you didn't have it in your Gmail because a lot of people didn't have Gmail yet. Right. You had Outlook. So my co-founders were like, and they're super smart guys, but they're like, dude, that would take like a year to build.
Yeah.
Right. Because it's like really complex business rules and all this stuff. Funny as it is, AI would have been a perfect use case here. But I was like, yeah, we're not going to do any of that. We're going to spend 6 weeks. We're just going to throw up a page where you can download the button and put it in your Gmail or put it in your Outlook or whatever was current at the time. And when someone clicks to unsubscribe, we're just going to forward that email to a general box.
Yep.
And we'll have a team of people that'll just go in there and unsubscribe for you.
Which used to mean like picking up the phone and actually calling people. Do you remember that? Get a call, somebody like, hey, can you take me off your email list, please?
Yeah, exactly. Right. And so the cool thing was it worked 100% of the time.
Yeah.
Because there was always someone to make sure that link got clicked. It was like sending it to your virtual assistant. Right.
Yeah.
But from what the user could see, they just assumed it was amazing software.
And they don't care, by the way. That's the thing. People get all caught up in that. Yeah, but like, it needs to be a software for who, right? If the outcome is the same, sure, you can't scale it, all that stuff, but it doesn't matter because again, like if nobody wants to pay to unsubscribe from email, no one wants to pay to install that thing, or no other company wants to buy that technology to put into their email client, it doesn't matter. Right?
Yeah, right. And that's the thing. Ultimately, they want the outcome.
Yeah.
I always find it funny whenever I order something on Amazon, it's not from Amazon directly. I always scratch my head. I'm like, I wonder where that order goes.
Yeah, right.
How it gets fulfilled. It goes back to the founder of Zappos, driving to the shoe store and buying the shoes for me and sending them to me. Or eBay, being a much more obvious culprit. But I don't care. If I get the product and it's what I paid for it, I'm good, right? And I think people vastly underestimate how powerful that is. But really what it's doing, in some cases it might actually generate revenue, by the way, but what it's doing is it's moving the ball forward. It's allowing you to operate in the business, right? Yeah. Immediately and learn right away. So as soon as we launched on Unsubscribe, we told like some friends about it. We had some investor friends. We sent it to them. They went nuts. It turns out we didn't see this coming, but investors were actually like our biggest customers because they're on every email list, every startup that's ever whatever has just added them. And so the investors saw it. A guy named Sar Gur from Charles River Ventures saw it. And he flew down the next day. We were in Santa Monica at the time. He flew down to Santa Monica the next day and gave us a term sheet. And because we didn't have to convince him that it would work, he's like, I used it. It worked in 5 seconds. He'd find out later that it was like an intern from USC that did the work, but he didn't care. I mean, the point is like, I don't care. Like, as long as it works.
What's our tech stack? Mostly 4 pizzas a day. Keep the interns fed. Like, that's the tech stack.
So let's take that a step further, though.
Sure.
So ideally, the first phase would be you could build some version of your actual product that would generate revenue and or validation. Ideally, revenue.
And again, when you say some version of that, we mean that can be the most watered down or even non-technological version. But we want to basically provide a proxy to getting to that same outcome, right? So we're basically, the outcomes are exactly the same in this phase one, which is the closest. And this is, so I think important to say, like, because I see where you're going with this, Will. We're working backwards. We're starting with kind of like,
we're saying
best
this
case
is most ideal.
you do this.
Yeah. Yep. And I think, again, people get, even at that stage, aren't open-minded enough to realize like how much they could open the aperture of the product. And ideally, it makes money. Before we opened that nightclub, like between the time that I had thrown like the last event at my house and the time we opened a nightclub, it happened to be New Year's Eve in between. And so we basically went to a venue in downtown and we said, hey, we want to basically invite all of our people to this, to your event. We want $20 for every person that we bring in. And I was a nightclub promoter, right? It wasn't really my job, but I was like, what the hell? I'm an entrepreneur. If I'm going to show up somewhere, I'm going to bring my friends, I'm going to get paid for it, right?
Yeah, right.
And so anyway, it was New Year's, so a lot of people were out. So 1,000 of our friends came and we got paid $20,000 in cash, right? And I was like, why haven't I been doing this all? I've been doing, right?
Nightclub. I just need to fill this.
Right. I have a buddy of mine. I was out with him last night, and he was throwing all these events that were more like targeted toward super high net worth individuals, like $100 million plus. And he's been throwing these events for years. He's a great guy. And he's like really like the center of gravity for all these folks.
Sure.
And a year ago, we're sitting down and I'm like, why aren't you getting paid for this? He's like, I don't really know how to get paid for it. I was like, a lot of people would pay to be in the room with people with that kind of portfolio, right? So we did. And we sat down recently and he's like, Will, I took your advice. I made $50,000 last month.
There you go.
It's just him, right? And I was like, yes. And so he wanted to talk about building like, almost like we have for founder groups, like this network of folks and do it on a paid basis. And I was like, yes, do exactly that.
Yeah.
And maybe someday you build a website. Probably not. Who cares? You're making money.
Don't need it, right? That's the thing. He's already found a way to deliver that value to at least $50,000 worth of people. That could have been one person. I don't know what he's charging, but he figured it out, right? So keep doing that. And I think that's the other thing that people get caught up in is like, well, then when will I build the product? When you can, or when you absolutely need to, right? Sometimes like I've seen this happen multiple times where you start with some sort of a service proxy or just the early version. You actually go a lot further on that than you might think, because it turns out it solves people's problem. And that's what they care about. You said it. They care about the outcome, right? How it's packaged, all of that. Sure. If it's easier to use or faster, cheaper, whatever, great. But at some point, if you're providing an outcome that they care about within a price that they're willing to pay, you've got what you need.
So let's go to the second option, which if for some reason we can't build the version of the product that we want, and by the way, this doesn't have to be one or the other. This could be both. You could do the first option and this. We'll talk about, can you build a service around the product?
Sure.
In other words, is there, kind of like we were saying, is there a way you can manually deliver this? Or on an ad hoc basis? So Ryan, we went through this when we launched Fundable in 2012. Do you remember how that went?
Yeah, I mean, geez. So with the launch, where there was a bit of fervor around the whole crowdfunding space. We opened up the platform, let people in, and it looked as though we had just opened a gym and let in people who'd never worked out before. Right? They didn't know whether to hold things over their head, how to put the clothes on, or these sweatbands, armbands, waistbands. We don't know what we're doing. And so there was just a lot of folks trying to raise funding that had never done this before, had no idea.
And why would
this work?
Right.
And so,
by the way, Ryan, that was a big assumption on our part.
It was a huge
big assumption. We like, let's spend all this time building a platform without ever really finding out whether our customers could be our customers. Something that's really funny about everything we talk about here is that none of it is new. Everything you're dealing with right now has been done 1,000 times before you, which means the answer already exists. You may just not know it, but that's okay. That's kind of what we're here to do. We talk about this stuff on the show, but we actually solve these problems all day long at groups.startups.com. So if any of this sounds familiar, stop guessing about what to do. Let us just give you the answers to the test and be done with it.
What we realized was that, yes, in fact, they could be our customers, but not without some significant additional help. Right. And if you recall, I shot the first emails for that thing out on December 7th of 2012. We thought, let's try it. Let's see what happens. Maybe we'll pick up a client or two. Picked up 15. And it was a great problem to have, but it was a problem because we were not suited to deliver to that many people. So we had to hurry and catch up. But we all of a sudden realized we can get paid quite well to do this work, and we can scale that part of it. That's easy because that was just adding some people and then building some process around it. But that completely changed the face of that business overnight because we went back to, hey, let's just simplify this. Let's make it a service. Let's get in and do the things that people don't know how to do and help them to get to the point that they actually care about, which is having a live fundraise and starting to raise funding.
Yeah, because if like everyone knew they needed money like that.
Yep.
that was not a broken.
That wasn't in question.
Yeah, there was no question that people know they needed money. But what they didn't know is what it took to raise it.
Yeah.
Right. They didn't know that you had to have a pitch deck or what a pitch deck is actually supposed to look like.
Oh, buddy.
Nobody
saw some
at all.
We saw some sweet pitch decks back in those
Still do. Right. That's where it's so fascinating to me. So we launched this service, which essentially allowed us to build pitch decks for people, build their fundable profiles, help identify investors that might make sense for them, et cetera. And that business goes on in like within a year to become like a 7-figure business for us, or like a main revenue driver for us.
Right.
Totally unexpected. And we looked at that and we were like, well, that's clearly not what our actual business was supposed to be, but it's informing what our product is supposed to do. And actually it helped us understand that equity crowdfunding wasn't going to work.
Yeah. Yep.
Right. And there were 2 assumptions that we made going in that proved to be relatively false, especially back in 2012. Assumption number 1 was that entrepreneurs would want money, sure, but would they be prepared to get it? Right. Yeah. Again, pitch deck, whatever. Right.
We missed on that one.
Right. The second was that investors didn't have enough deal flow. That they didn't have enough things to invest in. They needed portals to go find more deals, right? Yep. And it turns out that if you raise your hand and say, I have money, you will never be lonely again.
Yeah, you have no shortage
that'll be standing outside your door, right? They did not have an inventory problem. Now, to be fair, yes, investors did come on the platform and they did find deals to invest in and stuff like that. So, but it wasn't like investors were like, oh, finally, someone will take my money.
No, I would say it was a subtle democratization of where funding got distributed. We definitely did see some money get distributed to places that otherwise probably wouldn't have because of where they were geographically located. But it wasn't like a whole bunch of new checks. Are you going to cover that one too? Because I think that's an interesting third assumption that actually didn't come true. The fact that a bunch of new investors would be minted the minute they were allowed to, right? Because that was part of the whole dream of crowdfunding, was now anybody who self-accredits can now start to invest in startup companies. And that was absolutely true. They can and will were 2 very different positions. Yeah.
It turns out we already have a system for investing extra cash. If you have $5,000, it's called the public stock market.
Yeah.
And it's liquid and it's and look, you got to understand, Ryan and I are saying all this and we run that business. Fungible still around today, right? So this isn't us being critical about somebody else's business. This is our own goddamn business.
Yeah.
But what was interesting was the services component, I would say, did 2 really critical things for us that would allow us to become startups.com. The first thing it did is gave us a revenue source. Sure. So while Fundable was still trying to find its footing, like, pay to list and stuff like that, the services business just went to 7 figures immediately.
Yep.
Right. And it wasn't hard to scale. It just wasn't complicated. Right.
No,
and all of us came from services, so it also wasn't new to us. But the second thing it did is it allowed us to look at our product as maybe it's not the product. See, when it's your only product, you're not allowed to do that. Right. When it's your only product, you're not allowed to go, maybe this isn't that good.
Yeah. Maybe this isn't the thing. But
right.
The only thing. It has to be the thing.
Correct. We're all in on this. And if it's not this, it can't be anything else. Right. Yeah. Having this other revenue stream allowed us to say, when a lot of other people who had made the same bet we did were all in on it, we were like, let's try another bet. And so what we started to realize was the value in the market, or what was missing, if you will, wasn't just people trying to raise money. It was trying to build a startup at all. And that's when we expanded the thesis quickly. And I credit that to our services business, giving us the ability to kind of like stand on another limb, if you will,
Yeah.
and say, okay, we'll be okay on this side too. And that helped us get to the point where we're like, oh, we want to help with marketing. We want to help with,
Yeah.
all kinds of stuff. And we went on, a bit of an acquisition spree and acquired 6 more companies over the next few
Yeah.
years. And it completely changed our game. But had
Based
we
on
not
learnings,
launched the
right?
services business,
Yeah.
right?
It's something I harp on a lot, and it's the service proxy brings so much value. I think the one that you're talking about now is the one that represents the biggest piece of value to me.
Yeah.
The getting to revenue fast, yes, because that's just like, take that off the table. That has to happen, right? We got to get to revenue, so that's great that happens.
Right.
Once we get beyond that, it's these learnings that become so super powerful. In fact, I think I'm going to change up one of my models. I use this model a lot. I tell people it's my 4 P's of product. I'm going to have to change it to 5 now, because we just added another one, profitability. All right. So we can go a profitable, proven proprietary process. These are the things that you need to build a product, right? To build a good product, you need profitable, proven proprietary process. I'm just adding profitable today because we just covered off on it. It makes a lot of sense now. So you can build something that actually makes money. This helps you avoid the 5th P, which you don't want, which is pivot, which, as you and I both know, is a really nice turn of phrase on we built the wrong shit first.
Yeah, no,
So,
you know what? It happens all the time, right?
yeah,
It happens all the time. What's interesting about services businesses is they pay right away,
they pay right away.
I don't care if you're a landscaping company or McKinsey.
Yep.
Like they pay right away. And so you almost never, ever hear of companies raising money for a traditional professional services business. The first business I started, I think maybe the first business you started was professional services. We sold humans for time, right? And the reason it works so well in parallel with startups is because you can just go, right? You can just start selling and you get paid immediately. And a lot of folks are anxious about that. And they'll say, well, yeah, but I don't want to be doing services because it'll take time away from, building the actual product. And like you said earlier, what it'll do is it'll allow you to have money so you can build the product.
That's the thing. I think people treat that as though it's a foregone conclusion. They're like, well, if I start with services, then it'll slow me down from building my product. You know what else will slow you down from building your product? Not having enough money, and you will just stop building your product, right? It's not a foregone conclusion that you just, if I go services, or I could just go product. You can't just 100%. Go product, because product usually requires a lot of investment, a lot of time.
Right. And it's a gamble.
Yeah. It's a big gamble. Something else that I think is really important. The services will, and we touched on this a little bit, but let me cover it again. The services will help you build a better product. You will build a better product because you are in the mix with the clients, doing the work, seeing the reactions. The minute you're over on the product side, and what you have are some, even if you got a really well set up analytics system, you're looking at behavioral analytics. Where did they click? Where did they not click? Your learning's out the window, right? Yep. Yes, you'll pick up on some stuff, but you don't understand why it's not working. You can't see when they get frustrated. You can't see when they lean back or lean in, or roll their eyes, right? You got to have all of that data in the beginning so you can actually build the thing that they want, right? Because the stuff that we design on a whiteboard is at best like a 20% guess.
And it works every time on the whiteboard.
Sure does.
Right. What I say is, if option 1, build a smaller version of the product, doesn't work or doesn't fit. Option 2, build services around it. Option 3 is a catch-all. And option 3, I affectionately call, fuck it, do whatever takes money.
Whatever
makes money. Whatever makes money, right? Whatever takes to make money. When I see founders, and I know you do too, when I see founders who are like, I'm doing X, Y, Z, and honestly has nothing to do with what the business is, but it's paying my bills right now. Often that's their job. Awesome. Like literally their day job, what they were doing previously. But certainly, my favorite story of all time, and we had this amazing interview with him years ago, like a long time ago, long before they were public, was with Brian Chesky of Airbnb. And some of you have heard this story, and I always think these founder like origin stories aren't always entirely true, and I don't care, right? I just love the story either way,
right?
It's like, I love Avengers Endgame. I'm fairly sure it's not true, but I love the story.
I still like the story.
Yeah. And by the way, I have no idea, whether this isn't true. I just always paint that brush with all these origin stories. But the story goes like this. Brian Chesky and he had some other folks in the team at the time, were in the early stages of Airbnb, when kind of nobody really thought it was going to work, which is kind of what the early stages are. You see Airbnb now, and like, it's easy to say, oh, he must have always known it was going to work.
Sure.
And I remember Brian said at the time in the interview, and it's on, if you go startups.com and you look Brian Chesky, you'll see it's an amazingly long, detailed interview. And it was before he's kind of famous now. Like I saw Gwyneth Paltrow yesterday, like quoting him. Like he's kind of in that era, but this is before then. I remember he said, "Hey, I graduated from RISD, Rhode Island School of Design, and I was just going to be a designer. And when I say just going to be, I mean, that's all he was thinking about at the time.
Yeah.
And he's like, and I was living in my parents' basement. Right. So he's like not a stratospheric kind of like launch into the business world.
Right.
And so that they get the business starting. It's putting people up in strangers' houses. Like you can't come up with a more high risk model. Right.
I mean, think about that early. It's like, okay, so I just graduated. I'm going to be a designer. I'm living in my parents' basement. You know what would make this better is if I invited more people to live in my parents' basement alongside me. Like, doesn't sound like a genius idea at that level, right?
Okay, so this is just to set the stage that like Brian wasn't cruising through life at that point, okay? And they were out of cash completely. This is around the time of the Obama McCain election, and they were doing the primaries. And he and his folks came up with this idea to create Obama O's cereal, okay, cereal, and Captain McCain's, okay,
Captain McCain's,
Captain
my God.
McCain's, and he would take these boxes, you know, he printed these on spec, right? All this goddamn cereal. And he went out and hustled. I mean, I want to say this in the most respectful way possible, but if I were doing that right now, if I were rolling up in my van to a friggin' Democratic National Convention with a van full of cereal, right? I'd be like, my life is not going well right now, right? Like I would not be thinking this is going great. And I want to pause there to say that's the point. These people were doing these extraordinary things in order to keep their startup alive in ways that you would never think. Now, they were novelty items. He was selling them for $40 a pop, and he made like $30,000, which relative to what they needed in their stage in life was a ton of money. And it kept them alive. And then it literally kept them alive because he's like, all I ate were the leftover boxes of Captain McCain's for like the next 3 years, right? And I think to myself, I'm like, that's what saved Airbnb to allow it to live long enough. This is the key, to live long enough to become Airbnb. And it's the part that we always overlook is that like, oh, it's supposed to become Airbnb right away. No, it isn't. No great company becomes what it is right away. There's always this period, and you got to do whatever it takes to make money during that period.
Yeah, it's so critical. We talk about this a lot. I mean, the thing that separates these startups that make it from those that don't, of course, you have to have a good idea, good execution, but you got to have time to keep executing, right? We have seen so many companies end before their day simply because they weren't around long enough, because
100%.
they may have aimed too big too soon, right? And they were like, well, we're just going to go chase funding with no traction, with no proof of customers, with nothing. And then they end up stomping around, pitching their PowerPoint. Nobody invests, and so they're just gone, right? Where you look at that instead, you say, if you just pared that back and built a lighter version of that, built a service around that, or just gone and sold bulk cereal in cleverly printed boxes during people could take advantage of that. There was a pretty contentious election we just went through. I feel like
Kamala O's. I love it.
What we would have sold.
Yeah. Who knows? One of the cereals would have been orange though. But like earlier this week, a few days ago, I posted on the Reddit startups subreddit. What are some of the craziest things folks have done? The folks in there. Because it's funny to talk like the Airbnb story, but I feel like when we tell those stories, people don't believe they're true, right? Or not believe it's true. They're like, oh well, that's Airbnb. That's not me. It doesn't feel like so to speak. But it was cool. Like a ton of people responded, right? And their stories were all over the map. I had one guy that said he funded his startup by competing in video game conventions. Right, like he made $100,000 through the course of his startup competing in video game conventions that had nothing to do with his startup, right? Which I thought was great. Another guy said that he brokered domains. He sold domains in order to basically pay for his startup in its early days. And the point is, it kind of doesn't matter what it is, so long as it makes money.
It doesn't matter, right? Because the cash that comes out the other side spends exactly the same way, no matter what. Doesn't matter.
I usually keep names out of this, so I'm going to do it. But there's a guy that worked for us. You know who I'm talking about. Went on to go start his own company and sold it for like $800 million, right? Yes. Around that time when he was building that company, I remember I was at an Ohio State game and I'm walking by and I'm like, huh? He's at a sausage cart, like slinging sausages. Right? Yep. Yeah, at a football game, a college football game, right? On the weekend. to generate extra cash,
Generate extra cash.
keep his startup going. What I love about that, it's hustle, but it's also humility, right?
It's saying that it doesn't matter
I'll do
how I
whatever
get
it
there,
takes.
right?
Yeah.
I will do what I need to do and take my ego off the table. Startups will kill an ego real quick. They can also reinflate it very quickly, but yeah, and then just do what has to be done. And again, do what has to be done. I think this is where it gets really confusing. People are like, I can't possibly go sling sausages and make the $1 million I need to build my product. No, because you don't actually need $1 million to build the early version of the product, right? You're aiming too big, right? You're like, well, it's dream house or bust. No, it's not. Get the land, squat on the land, pitch a tent on the land, do whatever you have to do to just start to occupy that space. And to your point, make some money while you're doing it, and then things start to roll from there.
You know, I gotta say, like, I've built that gear personally where I'm willing to do whatever it takes in any capacity, right? Like, if you remember when we opened our last office, right? This is a long time ago, so 2012, whatever. Like, I was in there on the weekends, like setting stuff up, building stuff out, like by myself, right? Like I didn't care. I wasn't like, this is below me, right? I'd sold 3 companies by that point, right? But I was like, nothing's work is not below me.
Monitor arms don't attach themselves to desks, right? Yeah.
Oh my God. I remember this might have been the end of me. So not only like forget this was below me, this actually might have ended me. I remember I tried to carry, I did carry. I had this giant monitor. If you remember that we had in the sales room, that big TV.
Yes.
And it was an ancient TV, like a flat screen TV, and it weighed every bit of 100
That thing weighed 700 pounds. It was because it was plasma. Oh my God.
And I needed to hang it way up on the wall. So the way I got it up there is I created, this is hilarious. I created a series of steps made out of chairs and then desks and then chairs on top of desks that I would climb up while I'm carrying a 100-pound TV and hang it on the wall. Now, by the way, don't do that. That's just stupid, right?
We say do whatever it takes. Stay within OSHA. Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
Within the OSHA guidelines.
Yeah, don't do that. And as I'm carrying this, like, I don't want to go out like this. I don't want to be the guy that like that. This is my obituary, right?
Yeah.
But I got the damn TV hung up. But the point is, when you look at whatever it takes, you have to have the humility that comes with whatever it takes. Like, to me, it doesn't occur to me that you wouldn't just do the work.
Yeah.
But that doesn't apply to everybody else. You know, a lot of people were like, well, that just seems like a lot of hard work.
Yeah. Welcome to startups. You know, though, I run into folks with that. I do run into founders with that, but I think more often it's that they've just missed on the bite size. They just haven't leaned back far enough to go, I actually don't have to build all of that just to get started. And that's why it's not the humility. It's not that they wouldn't be willing to do that. They're not looking at it going, oh, if I make $2,500 a month driving Uber in my spare time, maybe that's not possible. I don't know how Uber works at this point. Make 2,500, whatever it is.
Yeah.
I can then pay an offshore developer to start building my app little by little by little by little, instead of saying, well, I need to go raise $1 million to build it all at once. You don't.
And I
just don't have to do that.
When we use this amorphous term called bootstrapping, I think a lot of people like hear about it, but they don't really understand what it means. Everything we just described, that is bootstrapping.
That's bootstrapping.
Bootstrapping is basically some variant of whatever it takes to generate cash now in order to be around long enough to build anything at all. Yep. You know, Ryan, you and I talk about this all the time. A big part of it is just feeding yourself so you can wake up every day and still work on this business, right? I mean, that's a huge part of it.
Yeah, and I think that, like, look, there is absolutely no shame in solvency. Like, quite the opposite. There's a lot of pride in solvency. And so I think that whatever you need to do to make sure that that's happening, and think about yourself first, right? You've said this 20 years ago, probably the first time I heard it. Startups don't run out of money. Founders run out of money. Your startup can sit on mothballs and do absolutely nothing for as long as it needs to. It's an idea. Absolutely. It doesn't need to eat, sleep, drink, play, be married, have kids, do anything. It just sits there, and it will. The minute you as a founder are making ends meet, it becomes really problematic. So self-solvency as a first step. And then that's a platform that you can build from, and you can start to slowly compile your startup company, or not slowly. I think that's kind of the point of today, is that, like, this is where people get really confused, because it is hard when you set your sights on this particular thing. You're like, no, I got to have the dream house. That's going to take us 24 months to build. We got to have this much money. It can feel problematic to set that back and say, no, actually, what we're going to do is start really small. The misconception is that somehow that slows things down. What I have seen time and time and time again is this accelerates things. because now you've built something much smaller that can move a lot faster, can get to revenue faster, get to profitability faster, can start to hire a team faster. And that actually snowballs. That little flywheel of momentum that you build up at that early stage can then actually surpass what you would have gone and done with the funding route, and then taking time to go and stomp around, pitch, get your cash, whatnot.
Absolutely. And so like what we're talking about is money equals runway.
That's it.
Right? Money equals lifespan.
Yep.
So all we should be focused on as founders is getting cash in the door. How we get it, whether we're throwing parties that opens up a nightclub, or whether we're selling shoes, that we don't actually have, or some freaking Captain McCain's. It doesn't matter how we get the money. It matters that we get the money, because we need that cash in order to survive. If we can't survive, there's no business. So our only focus at any given point is to bring the cash in the door.
Overthinking your startup because you're going it alone? You don't have to, and honestly, you shouldn't, because instead, you can learn directly from peers who've been in your shoes. Connect with bootstrap founders and the advisors helping them win in the Startups.com community. Check out the Startups.com community at www.startups.com to see if it's for you. Could be just the thing you need. I hope to see you inside.